Harold sits at his desk and fiddles with his purple crayon, thinking of what to do. After thinking it over for quite some time, he decides to go for a walk in the moonlight. Harold was enjoying his peaceful walk, but then he suddenly looked up. He noticed that there was no moon, and Harold needed a moon to walk in the moonlight. So he decides to draw his own to travel with him. Harold and the moon then set off to continue walking. Soon, Harold noticed that their path had come to an end. When he glanced down at his feet, he noticed he had nowhere else to go. So he decided to draw a long, straight path that he could follow. Harold sets off on his walk once again, taking his purple crayon with him. After walking for a little while, Harold saw that his path didn't seem to be going anywhere. As he glanced at the horizon, he noticed a small shortcut that he thought would lead them to a forest. But Harold didn't want to get lost in the woods, so he decides to make his own woods, a pretty small woods. In fact, only one tree, which turned out to be an apple tree. Harold thought that the apples would be quite delicious when they turned red. So Harold decides to draw a dragon to protect the tree. It was a frightening dragon. It even frightened Harold. As Harold's heart raced, he quickly backed away from the dragon as it growled at him. His hand holding the purple crayon shook, and suddenly Harold realized what was going on. But before he could do anything, he was over his head in the ocean. Harold quickly swims to the surface and gasps for breath. Looking around the horizon, he didn't see anything out there. But luckily, he came up thinking fast. And in no time at all, he was climbing aboard a trim little boat. He quickly set sail, and the moon sailed along with him. After he had sailed long enough, Harold made land without much trouble. He stepped ashore the beach, wondering where he was. The sandy beach reminded Harold of picnics, and the thought of picnics made Harold quite hungry. Suddenly, Harold was snapped out of his dream as his stomach grumbled loudly. With the thought of food, he then quickly pulled out his purple crayon and decided to draw out a picnic lunch. There was nothing but pie, but there were all 9 kinds of pie that Harold liked the best. When Harold finished his picnic, there was quite a lot left, and Harold hated to see it all go to waste. So he decides to draw up a deserving porcupine and very hungry moose to finish off his leftovers. As Harold and the moon walked away, he hoped that he could find a hill to climb in order to see his window. The higher he got, the more likely he could see his window, so he decides to draw a mountain out of a hill. If he went high enough, he thought he could see the window of his bedroom. He was tired and felt he ought to be getting to bed. He hoped he could see his bedroom window from the top of the mountain. But as he looked over the edge, suddenly, he slipped. There was no other side of the mountain, and he was free falling. But luckily, he had his purple crayon and his wits. In no time at all, he drew up a balloon and grabbed onto it. And he made a basket under the balloon big enough to stand in. He had a fine view from the balloon, but he couldn't see his window. In fact, he couldn't even see a house. So, Harold decides to draw his own house, with windows. And he landed the balloon on the grass in the front yard. But none of the windows was his window. He quickly looks around the house, trying to figure out where his window could be. He tried to think of where his window ought to be, so he decides to make some more windows. He made a big building full of windows. He made lots of buildings full of windows. He even made a whole city full of windows. But none of the windows was his window. He decided to ask a policeman to help. The policeman pointed the way that Harold was going anyways, but Harold thanked him. And so Harold continued along with his moon, wishing he was in his room and in bed. As Harold walked on a little bit longer, he suddenly realized something. Harold remembered where his bedroom window was, when there was a moon. It was always right around the moon. He got in it, and he drew up the covers. The purple crayon dropped on the floor. And Harold dropped off to sleep.